Welcome to Schweitzer Drive, a podcast where we explore what goes on between the generation of electricity and the light switch. Join Dave Whitehead as he interviews the entrepreneurs, innovators, and experts who are inventing the future of electric power.
Hi, welcome to Schweitzer Drive. I'm Dave Whitehead, CEO at Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories, and today we're going to be talking about some of the forces that are shaping the future of electric power. My guests are Tom Pyle, the president of the Institute of Energy Research, and Dr. Ed Schweitzer, the founder, president, and chief technology officer of SEL. Tom has spent 20 years working in policy analysis and advocacy, specializing in energy and the environment. The Institute for Energy Research is a nonprofit that conducts research and analysis on the functions, operations, and government regulation of global energy markets. Tom and the IER team work to understand the economics that drive the true costs of energy. Dr. Ed Schweitzer, who's been on the show a number of times, is a pioneer in power system protection, a prolific inventor, and is one of the most knowledgeable people I know when it comes to electric power, business, and really just on a whole number of topics. Thank you both for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Dave. And Tom, it's a pleasure to have you at SEL. And I love the work that IER puts out and refer lots of people to your website and its work daily.
Thank you for that. And thank you for the time today. It's been great to learn more about the important role that you play in making sure that our electricity is always on when we need it. So thanks for what you do.
Thank you.
There are so many external pressures on the electric power industry right now. World leaders just recently met in Glasgow to discuss their efforts to limit greenhouse gases and expand renewable energy. States and municipal governments across the country are setting ambitious decarbonization goals, including a move towards all electric, and I'll call it everything, whether it's cars, houses, you name it. So let's jump into these topics right now. There are lots of mandates for all green energy by 2040 or 2050, depending on where you live in the country. Most folks equate that to solar, wind, and batteries. Do you think their renewable-only generation sources are feasible for supplying reliable power 24/7? Tom, let's start with you.
I say no, and I don't think that there should be.
Why is that?
I don't think that we should be dictating the types of energy that we use to generate electricity. I think that a healthy, diversified supply is what's good, what makes it affordable and reliable. It also helps to, for example, when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, there's something that's creating those electrons, right? The idea that we can take a system that we've built over dozens, decades, 100 years or so, and just upend it with very specific types of energy, I don't think is beneficial for reliability. I don't think it helps businesses, and I certainly don't think it helps ratepayers.
Ed, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm kind of excited about all of the above. And I think we, the people, in as much as we get to decide with our utilities and other suppliers, that we're going to come to the best answers as long as the market is as free and open as possible. Many of these go together very well hand in hand, like the renewable but intermittent resources of solar and wind. They go so well with, say, the hydroelectric energy resources, where you can pump when there's excess solar or wind. And when at night or when on a calm day, you can run the water down the river a little faster and generate the electricity people need. Yet there is still a tremendous amount of need for energy 24/7 that could not be met with just those three resources together. And the fossil fuels still play and will play a very, very important role in keeping the lights on. I'm also a big proponent of nuclear power. We got off to a good start in our country with nuclear power, and we've taken a little break from it, pretty much take stock of what we can do and should do. And I think there's a fair amount of entrepreneurial energy going into the small modular nuclear sources that I'm really excited about.
Just to piggyback off of that, I think, what's the goal, right? If the goal is reducing emissions, we're doing that. We're doing that in this country from the switching, right? That's occurred because of the fracking revolution that we've enjoyed in this country. And as you said, Doctor, if it makes sense to put renewables somewhere, let's do it. I'm all for it. What I'm not for is this forced transition, because it's like when I was a kid, they said, don't force it, you'll break it, right? Your parents said that to you. And that's the truth about these systems, right? We're creating a lot of problems that are manifesting themselves. Look at Europe, for example, what's going on there because of the decisions that they made there to force these changes in the system faster than the system was ready to do that. And I only hope that it only costs a lot of money and lost opportunity to fix it. That's all I hope for, because the alternative is more people will die because of some of these decisions, unfortunately, if they have a really, really bad winter, for example.
Well, we already saw that on what I call the electrical Valentine's Day massacre in Texas that this past February. And I so much agree. We need all of the above, and we need local utilities and we the people to decide. When you asked earlier, rhetorically, I think, but I'll take it as a real question, what do we want? I really believe that when we go to plug something in over there at the wall socket, that we consumers want reliable energy at a fair price from a responsible supplier. And to most of us, being a responsible supplier is one who will respect the environment and take into account that we all want to live on a very healthy planet.
I think going back to the mandates of, say, 2040 or 2050, those are the mandates. So an objective has been set out. Probably what's not been clearly defined is how you go from where we're at today to those objectives of 2040.
When we set a mandate like that something shall happen by 2040 or 2050, and completely ignore what the cost-benefit argument of it is, and maybe not ignore it, but even distort what that argument is, I got a little bit of a problem with it. That I think things have become quite political, and I know there's all kinds of scientific work done by many, many different institutions and people, but the general arguments are sort of harsh and political, if I will, in the worst sense of that term, not the good sense, and that I'd much prefer to see these decisions being made and progress being made with a lot more free market, or as Milton Friedman would talk about, the inseparable nature of our economic and political freedom.
Yeah. And, if you look at what's happening in the energy industry, I call it a death spiral of subsidization. When you start out with, the renewables industry basically said, well, we need a leg up because oil and gas has been dominating for so long, and they've gotten a lot of support from the government. So what's wrong with us getting some too? And then you've got politicians who support that and prop up these resources that wouldn't otherwise exist in the marketplace, right? The niche that you talked about where you pair wind with hydro. That's good. That's a market, advantage that they would have together. But when you put it somewhere else where it makes no economic sense other than for the subsidies, and the subsidies go away, they stop producing it there, right? So if that's the decision that company made, that means it's not sustainable in the marketplace, and that doesn't help us long term, right? So that's the issue that I have is when those folks get their subsidies, then it puts pressure on, say, nuclear. And then the nuclear guys say, well, they got theirs and they got theirs, so I want ours. And then all of a sudden, the market has become a function of government decisions.
So I couldn't agree with you more, Tom, in that that's where I keep coming back to, that I'm not so sure in fact, I doubt that subsidies and mandates by government will lead us to a cleaner and greener planet sooner than the free enterprise of us individuals who want to live in a clean, healthy environment would do by our own means. And put it plain and simply, I think we're making things worse, not better.
We have some examples in California and Texas regarding a lack of dispatchable electric generation that has impacted power system reliability and resiliency. This term has come out, this bridge energy. You know, we want to be all solar or wind, but we can't get there tomorrow because it's not reliable enough. And that, just listening to you folks go back and forth, maybe bridge energy is even a bad term because it predisposes at an end state, and maybe that's not the end state we want to be in.
Well, California is needing to turn to new gas-fired electric power production because of the shortages at certain times of day, mainly dark times of day, shortages of electricity. And in Texas, I don't really think the blackout was very much due to a lack of renewables, except for the fact that the wind wasn't blowing out in West Texas, and that the major problems was a cold snap caused a big reduction in or increase in the demand for natural gas. And as pressures in pipelines started to drop, the regulators and controllers in government and quasi-government entities started calling for the electric power utilities to use less gas, making more available for furnaces. And people's gas furnaces couldn't run without the electricity, and a lot of people became quite cold. So we have become very dependent upon natural gas in Texas because we moved away from coal.
That's right. That was what I was going to add to that conversation, because we had basically the same weather further north in the MISO area, but they had coal generation, right, to back that up. So they didn't have as significant a problem as they had in Texas during that cold snap.
So I can't say I'm a big fan of burning coal. On the other hand, coal will be burned on this planet for, unfortunately, I believe quite a few years to come. One good thing about it when it's burned in the United States is we burn it as cleanly as humanly possible, I believe. And when we export our clean coal to other countries, I can't say that the same happens. So in a all-in global perspective, although burning less coal is probably better,
mm-hmm.
that burning it at home is better than burning it halfway around the world.
Yeah, but that leads to the larger equation here when you're talking about emissions, right? And also, why are we so hyper-focused on the power generating sector? It's such a small piece of the overall pie, right? And I think
I think the reason is because solar panels and wind turbines produce electricity.
Or I think a big coal plant is a big, easy target versus 1,000 individual cars or what have you, right?
Or the agriculture sector.
Correct.
Or the Portland or the cement, that's required to build things, it's the political constituency. Let's be honest. Like you said, they're an easier target. So my biggest issue is, if this is the existential threat that it is, we are not, the folks that are advocating for a lot of these policies are not doing it fast enough. And they're not doing it with the level of urgency that they claim or that they say that it is. Glasgow is a perfect example. The two largest emitters in the world, the largest emitter in the world by far decided that the leader decided he wasn't going to participate. India, which I'm very fond of, have some family roots. My wife's parents are from there. They agreed to go net zero by 2070 if they get $1 trillion from developed countries, right? Like that's not the talk of urgency or existential threat, right? That's the part that drives me crazy, is a lot of this conversation is more of a political conversation than it is from the standpoint of an environmental challenge that has to be addressed. Because if it were, we would be celebrating fracking.
We would. We should be.
Because it has led to the largest reduction of emissions by far in this entire conversation across the globe.
I so agree, and that's why the United States leads the world in the reduction of its CO2 production.
Bringing this back a little bit closer to where we're at today in Washington State. Washington State is considering banning hooking up natural gas in new buildings, and probably bans for residential construction will likely follow. What benefits and challenges do you see with these potential mandates?
Well, any kind of a subsidy or a mandate is an economic distortion. It limits your and my freedom to choose. And nothing net good is going to come out of any subsidy or mandate. So we'll start there. A mandate not to use natural gas, say for heating or cooking, is going to lead to higher prices for electricity. It's going to cause a whole bunch of capital to go into building more capabilities into the transmission and distribution systems. It's going to cause capital to go to less efficient, possibly even less energy efficient means of generating the electricity that we will need for the greater consumption. Let me give you an example. In most of our homes that are heated by natural gas today, we benefit from energy efficient furnaces that are 90 to 95% efficient, because they not only benefit from recover the heat of combustion, but also the heat of condensation. So as you know, a modern furnace can vent out of a piece of PVC pipe. So you burn the gas, you get 90% of the heat into your house. Now let's suppose that we take that same gas, because electricity's got to come from somewhere, and we stick it into a gas-fired power plant, even a super efficient combined cycle gas plants. And maybe we could get 65% there, say. So that's 65%, then knock off another 10% for transmission and distribution losses, maybe a little more, 12%, and you're down right around 50%. So just real rough numbers, for an element of gas, it's twice as valuable and efficient to me to burn it in my furnace at home than it is to pay a utility to burn it, transmit it to me in electricity. They're taking a lot more capital up just so I can run it through an electric heater in my house.
So you can feel better about the decision you made, that you've somehow done your part for the planet, when all of that logic falls to the wayside. Plus, I love cooking with gas.
In this hypothetical argument, I hope it's hypothetical, Dave, we didn't get to make that choice. And I want to make that choice. If I do make the choice and understand the laws of physics here and the choices that are available to me locally, I believe that you and I will make the best choices for all things considered, and that includes the planet.
Amen. That's exactly what I would say about it too. I mean, if you don't have the choice to make, then what is that, right? That's not a market. That's a I know best. This is how it's going to be, in spite of all of the logic that you just laid out.
If I don't get to make the choice, I'm led to wonder who did make the choice and why did they make that choice, and how might they have benefited and I might have lost in it.
With all these different generation source, whether we're talking about wind, solar, gas-fired plants, coal plants. Ed, let me direct this one to you. What do you think the transmission and distribution systems of the future are going to look like? And maybe is transmission or distribution even the right terms we should be using to describe electric networks of the future?
Well, I like to try to get back to first principles whenever I can. Things like F equals MA and you can't push on a rope. So what would be the most important first principle here is that electric transmission and distribution move energy at the speed of light, 186,000 miles a second, 11 inches in 1/1 of a second. So now you can imagine how important that fundamental physical property of moving energy electrically is to intermittent sources such as solar or wind. So you can imagine an element of electricity, say a kilowatt hour being produced somewhere, maybe in a solar panel at this moment, and that the transmission and distribution networks can, at the speed of light, find a ready and able customer who would like to buy that. So it's a market that clears in milliseconds. I think we mentioned Texas earlier. Texas is about 3 milliseconds wide when it comes to moving electricity at the speed of light. So when you turn a switch on and say over in Houston, that you'll have the electricity 2 or 3 milliseconds after it's produced by a wind turbine out in West Texas. So that's the miracle. So we need, just generally as society grows, we need more transmission and we need to make better use of the transmission that we have. So I think the transmission and distribution systems will continue to grow. That certainly when it comes to real and government-driven demand for electric cars, that there will need to be a lot of increase in the electric power distribution systems in our neighborhoods.
Oh, let's pull on that thread then. So if we turn to all electric homes, cars, factories, everything, what sorts of electric build-out would this require, and what effects might this have on our energy costs?
Our local utilities said they would have to essentially double their resources. So
if we were to get rid of all the gas.
Yeah, to get rid of the gas, to replace all that with electric power services, it would double it. And here at SEL, I think we did a sort of a back of envelope calculation that if we don't use a lot of gas, we just use it for heating, and then most of the year we don't have to heat because the people and our computers and lights and everything else provide enough heat. But we use sufficient gas that the peak load electrically would go up about 50%, and we'd have to build a lot more electrical circuits to provide that load.
That'd be just our operating costs, though, too, right? There'd be a capital expense we'd have to do to replace all the heaters around the buildings and stuff like that. That's another huge expense.
There is the capital cost, too, of putting in the larger conductors and the more circuit breakers and more circuits. And there's a lot of capital that would go into it. And to no avail. The planet's not any greener. In fact, it might be a little browner after you do it all for the reasons we talked about earlier.
You take that up to the national level where they're talking about, all electric vehicles. And, we've seen studies that what would it take to get to net zero in the north, the Northeast, for example. And you're talking about, huge taking offline huge amounts of electricity while you're replacing it with non-emission, but not nuclear, right? That's not part of the plan, at least for now. And you're talking about building huge transmission lines, for example, to import some of that power from Canada. They can't even do the Northeast with the amount of power generation that they would have to increase by simultaneously electrifying the fleet and getting rid of those resources and replacing them with, adding different resources on. So imagine, spread that out across the country. It's not doable. Most of the places where they're advancing these policies are importing their power from other places. So eventually, at some point, you're not going to be able to take it from somewhere. So what's going to happen then, right? So it has all kinds of,
That's
implications.
exactly why California right now finds itself in the situation of needing to build, I forget what it was, about 5 or 6 large gas turbine electric power generating stations.
Yeah. And now in the UK, for example, or France at least, and the UK, they said, all right, maybe we'll put nuclear back on the table.
After they took it off the table.
Right.
Hey, you mentioned there's a couple terms that drive me crazy for something, especially when we're talking about a green environment. It's net zero or carbon neutral, right? And that just seems kind of like I don't know if it's a scheme or a scam, but do you do the world any better by just claiming to be net zero or carbon neutral? It seems like, well, maybe I reduce a little bit here, but I'm going to spend it over there for my, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's all kinds of discussion about what that means, right? When a company says they're 100% renewable, what does that really mean? Because, they're getting their electrons just like everybody else, right? So they're buying offsets and doing all kinds of accounting, tricks, if you will, to kind of achieve that goal. I would say that, when a politician says we want net zero by 2050, think about the fact that politician is no longer at least going to be a politician by 2050. If he's still around, he or she, right? So a lot of this is easy to say, because they're leaving the problem to somebody else, right?
Couldn't agree with you more.
And the bill will come due, but they won't be around to be blamed for it. And that sort of leads to your point about it.
So years ago, some Idaho legislators were newly elected, and they came up the Idaho Panhandle, and I don't know, they got a little lost and came over to Eastern Washington, and I fed them lunch, and so that they'd have to listen to me talk a little bit. And I gave a little talk about electric power. And at the end, one of them said, should Idaho have a green energy mandate like Washington State and many others? And I remember thinking about the question, and my response was, I'll make you a deal. I won't write law if you don't design the power system.
Amen. And going back to your point about what the future looks like, and I use the Yogi Berra, I can't predict, I can't make predictions, especially about the future. People ask me all the time, well, what's the price of gas going to be? Like, if I knew, then I would be sailing around in a yacht. I wouldn't be here in this podcast chatting with you guys, because I'd be really wealthy. The future should be decided by entrepreneurs, engineers, consumers. The future should be decided by the marketplace, and not by, in my opinion, not by, folks sitting in boardrooms or in academic institutions drawing out the future on a map, because the human factor always eludes them, right? Look what happened in Maine. The voters just rejected a transmission line that is a key component of their clean energy plan, of their clean energy mandate, by 60%, right? So you have to take into account the real impacts, the human sort of, I don't want that thing running through my yard or in my vista, right? There's a lot of on the ground impacts that people aren't taking into consideration when they draw out these grand plans for what the grid should look like 50 years from now. So,
I love electric power. I've dedicated my career to making it safer, more reliable, more economical. And I would not like to live in a house right next to an electric power line. I just don't think it's attractive. I don't like to listen to the crackle of it. And as important as these assets are, I understand, and I'm very empathetic about that. You went back earlier, you said something about entrepreneurship and creativity, innovation. And when the government does decide and mandates solutions, we don't see something that might have been otherwise invented. Maybe a professor or somebody in a basement somewhere is coming up with some new ideas that need to see the light of day, that they need to attract capital through free enterprise and through the normal selling of stock and so forth that we're used to in a free economy, and versus somebody running to the government and saying, hey, favor my technology because of fill in the blank of the sophist's argument. So I get really worried about us not necessarily seeing what might have been when we mandate and standardize on solutions.
This leads into my last question. This is great. Every new administration in D.C. enacts new policies with timelines that are decades long, and many times actions taken by one administration are overturned by the next. Would there be a benefit to developing a U.S. energy policy, and how might that benefit businesses or communities who are trying to map out their energy futures? Tom, I'll let you go first.
I think the best energy policy that the U.S. should develop is to first do no harm. And I think that the second tier of that is to start to unwind their involvement in the industry, in the space. We have seen that in spite of attempts to regulate oil and gas, for example, we had a fracking revolution, right? I've seen, all these, a lot of the environmental laws and a lot of the energy policy in this country was in response to one major incident, the Arab embargo, right? It led to this notion that we've got to keep as much of it in our country as possible with respect to oil, for example, which led to price controls, which led to rationing, which led to export bans, right? That had, basically took us out of the market for oil. I'm just using oil as an example because it's on everybody's mind. When we lifted the export ban and we developed, much more oil in this country because, again, back to fracking, we not only got out of our problem of importing more oil, but we became a net exporter in 2019 for the first time since 1950. Saudi Arabia tried to break our shale producers. They failed. Why? Because they were able to turn on and turn off the switch, so to speak, much faster than the large offshore oil development that we were traditionally doing in this country. They couldn't break shale. The United States became the swing producer in the global oil markets, right? OPEC is no longer the problem, right? So to me, it's the government should set sort of a basic set of rules for everyone to follow and make sure that we have safeguards for environmental health safety, and then stand back and watch what we can do as Americans.
I agree virtually with everything you said, Tom. And it started me thinking again how President Jimmy Carter created, during those days you were speaking on, he created the Department of Energy with the objective of the United States becoming energy independent. And what really brought us to energy independence was the tremendous success of fracking. And I don't really know that the DOE had much of a role in the industry of fracking, yet it, really was the biggest cartel buster that I've witnessed in my lifetime.
Well, gentlemen, I don't know if we solved a problem today, but it sounds like we certainly advanced the conversation. I think that's the first step in making America, the world, a much better place.
We might not have solved it, but we at least stirred it.
I think so. Tom, Ed, thank you very much for being on Schweitzer Drive. I appreciate the conversation.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Thank you for stopping by Schweitzer Drive. Join us again as we learn about, explore, and celebrate electric power. For more information about the show, please visit selinc.com/Schweitzer Drive.